So, welcome back to this plenary session number 7 on human capital and gender, about migration, mobility, education, and adaptation. And I think we are going to be confronted with a very skilled and knowledgeable panel participation here, both of researchers and practitioners, which I think is an excellent combination. We follow the same procedure as in the previous plenary sessions, which means that, our timekeeper will make sure that the 12 minutes or so will be allotted, and then hopefully we'll have a final and good discussion. And our first presenter is actually an example of a combined practitioner and a researcher. Erika Hayfield from Faroe Islands has been involved both in ministerial work on the topics that she will be presenting on, but at the same time is involved as a researcher and a teacher at the University of Faroe Islands. And the title of the presentation is What's Gender Got to Do with It? I would like to have sung it, but maybe you will be singing, I don't know. But it's about migration and gender in the periphery. So please approach the podium.
Thank you, dear guests and organisers, and thank you very much for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here, I must say. Today I'll be taking a very brief look at migration and gender in the periphery and semi-periphery from a Faroese perspective. Now, in the Faroe Islands, there live 48,000 people, and like many peripheral areas, we experience out-migration by young people, and especially young females. Now, we have a large female deficit in the Faroe Islands, which has grown steadily for 80 years. So this is not actually a new phenomenon here in the Faroe Islands. And these young people, and especially maybe young women, they go abroad to get an education, to work, to get new experiences and so on. And unfortunately, not enough of them return. In my presentation, I will argue that migration research must also look beyond practical and economic motivations for migrating. Because migration, I will argue, is deeply embedded in Faroese culture. Therefore, an understanding of the migration culture has implications for how youth and gender issues are integrated into policy. So I see it very much as a complex issue. Right. I will argue my case by highlighting some of the issues with respect to the Faroe Islands culture migration and the gender culture and gender structures in the Faroe Islands, and also how this may implicate policy surrounding migration and mobility. Now, earlier this year, I conducted a study amongst youngsters in the Faroe Islands in 2 age groups. One was a 14 to 15-year-old age group, and the other one an 18 to 24-year-old age group. The youngsters, and in my talk today, I will actually be focusing on the 14 to 15-year-old age group. These youngsters drew a life map, and what they did was to map out their past and also how they imagined their future, where they ended up, where they thought they'd end up living, and what they'd end up doing, and so on. And I subsequently interviewed these young people. So what we will be looking at today is actually a very sort of preliminary analysis which I've done of the data. So as I mentioned earlier, migration is very much embedded in cultural and social life in the Faroe Islands. And it was very clear that there were some discourses coming through in the interviews. And one of them was of migration as very much being natural in life. So the young people would talk about it being very much a natural part of growing up, to move away, and very much a natural part of developing and becoming adults, becoming knowledgeable, becoming educated, becoming inspired. And indeed, when looking at the interviews, it was the majority of those already at the age of 14 to 15 said that they will leave the Faroe Islands. And that was all of the girls said that they would leave, and half of the boys. But maybe I should add as well that the boys that said they were not going to leave directly said that they wanted to go out, what we call to ships, which means going out fishing or going out sailing, somehow having your profession at sea. So that may indeed entail some travelling as well. Now, when they said that they would leave, it was very much for educational purposes, but it was also for, and including travelling and maybe spending a year abroad as an exchange student and so on. But very much their perspective involved leaving. And they saw it very much as a necessity for improving and developing, but still there were frequent intentions amongst these young people that they intended to return to the Faroe Islands. Now, what I'd like to do is, just to illustrate an example from my data, it was a girl called Annie. She's from a village, and she's 14 years old. And I would say that her account was probably fairly symptomatic sort of throughout the data. Now, Annie told me that she wants to be a doctor, a nurse, or a musician. So Annie says, if I trained to be a doctor, I would probably move to Denmark, but then I would move back to the Faroe Islands. And nurse, I would move back to the Faroe Islands when I'd completed my training. So I asked her, okay, but if it was music, would you also move back to the Faroes? She says, well, that's not certain. They make much better music in the USA compared to the Faroes. I don't really like Faroese music. I prefer to become better and learn more over there. So we see here that Annie's personal development is that which will dictate where she ends up living, at least from her perspective as a 14 to 15-year-old. So she does not appear to have mapped out her life based on where she's going to live, but rather on how she's going to live. Now, I'd like to stick to Annie for a couple of more minutes, because despite Annie's account of wanting to leave, she is very clear that she prefers the Faroes. So Annie says, well, I much prefer living in the Faroes, but you learn so much more in the USA. Then you will learn it really well, the music she's referring to. I don't think you do that in the Faroes. So I say to her, but if you could train to be a doctor or nurse, which you can in the Faroes, you can train to be a nurse in the Faroes, would you like to do your training here, or would you still like to go somewhere else to train? And he says, I don't know. I expect I would go to Denmark to train. I really like Denmark. I also really like the Faroes, but you can always come to the Faroes when you've time off. Now we see here that even presented with the opportunity of doing her training in the Faroes, she still intends to leave. But also, she's very aware that she's a very mobile person, and she can always come back for periods of time. So she's attached to the Faroes, but quite comfortably perceives her belonging or attachment to be in more than one place. So we could say that she's potentially what Ulrich Beck calls place polygamic. That means married to more than one place, having a transnational existence. And I think this is very much the reality of young people, especially in the periphery. So we see here maybe not so much a tension of where she's going to end up living or where she belongs, but rather a sense of an open mind and a very open world, which I think is a reality for young people in the periphery. Now, there were other clear discourses coming through in the interviews. One was the discourses of freedom, and there were two very conflicting discourses of freedom. The first one was the children reflecting on their life in the Faroes and their growing up as being a very free childhood. It was a very positive thing for them. They felt safe, they felt few constraints, they felt they could live a relatively uncontrolled life in the sense that the adults were quite comfortable, that they could sort of walk around the village or the town by themselves because it's safe, relatively speaking, in the Faroe Islands, as in many small communities. So few constraints, a very positive thing for them. Yet, conflictingly, they So they like staying in the Faroes because of the freedom, the childhood freedom, but they also said they needed to leave because of lack of freedom. Freedom from social constraints, from a lack of anonymity. So we see here that the freedom to be anonymous for them, i.e. moving away and being somewhere where not everybody knows you, where you don't have the security of your own parents, because in growing up and developing involves trying out new things. And if you're not anonymous and you make mistakes, it's very public. So everybody finds out if you do something stupid or wrong or whatever. And they talked about saying that they said people talk about you. So it's a constraining culture. So what at one point is a sense of freedom in childhood becomes a constraining lack of freedom, which also is one of the reasons that they feel they need to leave. And sort of related to that, they spoke very much of opportunities to develop in the elsewhere, so i.e. often in urbanised areas. So they felt they had restricted opportunities in the Faroes, which they felt that they wanted to pursue elsewhere. Now, in terms of a culture of migration, one thing that very much perpetuates a culture of migration is networks, and that's consistent with a lot of research on migration. So we see the culture of migration being perpetuated through these networks. So, and I think this is very important also in small societies, that those who are away very much still exist in the societies that they have left. They're very much spoken about. They come back to visit. They're mobile. So they still have an existence in the societies that they've left. So almost all of those young people I spoke to showed reference to others who currently or have lived abroad. And Naina, who's from a large town, I should maybe add beforehand that there's a very large concentration of Faroese people in Denmark. And we heard from Rasmus yesterday that there's a large concentration of Greenlanders in Denmark. The same applies to the Faroese, and that's or particularly Copenhagen. So moving away, in a sense, you have this diaspora, it becomes less risky. It's risky in itself moving, but having a community to come to, a social capital, and these options to help establish yourself is very important for these young people. And I think Naina is a good example of this. She comes from a large town, she's 14 years old, and she says, I don't want to go anywhere else than Denmark because I can speak Danish. Everyone goes to Denmark, and I know what it's like to be in Denmark. I have often stayed with my aunt in Denmark. She lived in the Øresund student residence, which we see on the photo. So, and I saw also many of the older, many of the young people in the older group said, look, I know it's the easy option just going to Copenhagen, but it's so much less risky. So there's a risk element for these young people as well. So I've spoken about the culture of migration, but what is it that perpetuates the out-migration, particularly of young females, and why do they not return? Well, I think it's very important to look at the gender culture and the gender structures of the Faroe Islands, which is probably quite similar to a lot of areas where there's maybe a sort of primary industries and more traditional ways of life. We have very much a traditional gender culture in terms of gender roles and gender values. So, just to mention an example, we see this very clearly in the labour market. There are relatively few females in management positions, particularly in the private sector. And importantly as well, more than half of females work part-time. And that's in all age groups, not just age groups where there are where young women who have children. So this is like a complex issue, but there's certainly some structural exclusion on the labour market. And there are some women who voluntarily choose to work part-time, and I'll come back to that in a second. But there's also very much now I was in charge of the strategic plan for population growth for the Faroese government. And part of that work involved going elsewhere, for example, Denmark and England, and speaking to Faroese who were living abroad. And amongst these Faroese, it was very clear that there was a perception that the labour market in the Faroe Islands had few career opportunities, especially for females. But also, as Sundström has pointed out, there is a degree of familialism in the Faroese welfare model. So what does that mean? Well, in the cases where the welfare model does not provide sufficient security net for people, for example, care of the elderly or care of children, then it's expected that it'll be the family that sets in and helps out. The family, typically, and most frequently being the female. So it means that the female has got quite a lot of responsibility in that sense. But also, we have a very highly mobile people. And when I say highly mobile people, it tends to be the men. We have over 3,000 men who are long-distance workers. Now, in putting that into perspective, that we've got 48,000 people and X amount of people on the labour market, that's a large proportion of people on the labour market who are long-distance workers. Being away, and therefore it is hard for females to pursue careers in the Faroese labour market if they're to work full-time and also take care of all everything at home, if you like. So I see it very much as a key issue is to address gender culture, not just for getting females to return, and young people generally, but also to provide them with opportunities in the Faroe Islands, opportunities that might mean that they would pursue educational opportunities in the Faroe Islands. Just to mention an example of the traditional gender culture. Interestingly, recently there was a debate about extending the paternity leave for men just 2 weeks. And interestingly, I saw in one study that females were actually more against men having paternity leave than the men were. And I think that is very much a good example of reproducing a gender culture where females are hanging on to their sources of power. Now, to end with, what does this mean for policy? Well, the first thing is that I think that there's a tendency not to take out-migration very seriously, or certainly not seriously enough. And there's a lack of understanding of the cultural dynamics surrounding migration and out-migration. So it's essential that we incorporate the gendered nature of migration into policy and create educational opportunities as well as a dynamic study environment. It's not enough to have educational opportunities. Young people, and here with particular reference to young females, they are looking for a dynamic study environment. They're looking for student residencies, and they're looking for that dynamic environment where they can be amongst other young people and have great discussions and just have a general, have fun as well while they're studying. So I think that's something that we've not paid enough attention to in the Faroe Islands. We're trying to create the educational opportunities without providing the environment. We also need to provide opportunities for migrants to return. And it's sometimes seen as very difficult to return amongst the Faroese. They feel that the labour market appears to be very closed. They leave the Faroe Islands maybe when they're 18, 19, 20. They have little experience of the labour market. They know little about it. It's very difficult for them to see through the structures and know where to start looking for jobs, how to start networking and so on, because they don't really maybe know the right people or have the experience of networking in the Faroes. And last but not least, I think it's really important, and I think this is maybe one of my key messages, is to enable mobile lifestyles. Turning back to my point about young people being experiencing place polygamy, i.e. having an attachment to more than one place, it's really important that in small communities, in peripheral areas, that we enable lifestyles that does not necessarily mean that you move back and and that's where you will stay. Just to mention an example, the young people in Denmark feel it's very difficult to move back home because there's hardly any affordable good rent accommodation. So if you move back home, then you've got to get a high mortgage, and so you've got to be very indebted, and you've got to be very, very certain that's what you want, because it's very difficult to leave again if you're tied down economically. So enable mobile lifestyles, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, why not live in more than one place? Why not have the opportunity to move back home for a few months, contribute in a project, or stay 6 months of the year in the Faroes, 6 months somewhere else? Why is it so difficult to create those structures? Well, certainly we have a problem there, or a challenge there in the Faroes. And I would like to leave you with a quote from a female who's 23 years old, studying in Denmark. And she says, "You don't move to the Faroes until it's it that you want to do. Because firstly, it's so close to get in, because of mortgages and so on. And when you finally got in, then it's not something that you can just let go of." So I think that highlights very much the fact that many of these young people living abroad feel that they've got to be so dead certain before making a choice to move back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erika, for an exciting presentation that I'm sure will add to our discussions afterwards. Our next presenter is Heleniak, who also have had this double life of being a practitioner in international organizations working on demography, but at the same time a very well-known researcher on demographics, and with especially focusing on Russian, and therefore his presentation now will be on the changing gender composition of the Russian North. So, Tim, please.
Thank you. I feel like a little bit of an oddball at this conference. There's only a couple of Americans on the panel, and I'm actually the only American male, I think, on the panel. And to make this, it's a bit unfortunate that there's not a bigger representation either from Alaska or talking about Alaska, our Arctic state. And to make this even further odd, even though I'm an American male, I'm not going to be talking about Alaska. I'm going to be talking about Russia. And Rasmus gave me the title of my talk, The Changing Gender Composition of the Russian North. I'd like to begin by thanking my sponsors. This research is part of a project called Polar Peoples, Past, Present, Future, looking at different mix of methods looking at population change in these 3 different time periods across the Arctic. And I'm happy to have this slide included because I think there's a representative from the National Science Foundation here, so be sure this gets back to headquarters. So what I'm going to be looking at, there's been a number of talks, including Erika's previous talk. For most of the Arctic, there's actually been an increase in the male sex ratio, the ratio of men to women, because there's been a large female outmigration. This seems to be documented across the Arctic. It's different in the Russian North. Over the last couple of decades, there's actually been a decline in the male population. And so that's what I'm going to be looking at. I'm going to be looking at something through the prism of something called the population balancing equation, and don't be afraid, this isn't high algebra or anything. It's basically just the population at the beginning of the period, plus the births minus the deaths, plus in-migrants minus out-migrants equals the population at the end of the period. And those first 2 components, births and deaths, add up to what's called natural increase or decrease if the deaths exceed the births. And then the second 2 components are net migration. And like I say, neither of these components of population change are gender neutral, and I'll show that. Just to give some historical background, almost what's happened in Russia, the other post-Soviet states over the last couple of years, there's been something called the triple transition. This is the economic transition away from a centrally planned economy towards a market economy. This included privatization of large sectors of the economy, the kind of withdrawal of the state from economic planning, withdrawal of subsidies, and a lot of these were northern subsidies, Arctic subsidies. There's been a kind of downsizing of the economy. The social transition, this is the kind of liberalization of society, a kind of a new social contract was put in place, and also increased mobility. Well, increased mobility and at the same time decreased mobility of different people. And I show this map here of net migration by region over the last 20-year period, and you see all these regions in orange and red are those regions from which there's been rather substantial outmigration. This is Magadan, where you had net migration of about 66% of the population. Chukotka, you had 3 out of every 4 people leave. There's also been the political transition, the breakup of the Soviet Union, people returning their ethnic homelands and other newcomers to the Arctic. So this is the backdrop against which I'll examine some of these trends. So there's been a lot of socioeconomic change in Russia, and it's impacted the north rather considerably. So it's these 15 regions that I'm going to be looking at, and when I say the north, in some of my charts, it'll be these 15 regions that I'm talking about. But just to put this in a little bit of perspective, this chart shows the male sex ratio in Russia and selected other countries in 2010. This is from the United Nations. And you can see here globally, there's about 102 males per 100 females. And this is not at birth. This is among all ages. And you can see here down at the bottom, I highlight Russia, which has about 86 males per 100 females. And some of the other lowest in the world are these other post-Soviet states that have either large Russian or large Slavic populations. So keep that in mind. And this is nothing new to Russia. Russia has historically had a very low male sex ratio. Going back to 1897, this is the last Tsarist census at a time in Russia's demographic transition where you should have actually had a surplus of males. You actually had a deficit, about 95 males per 100 females. Men suffered the brunt of World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Civil War that followed. And then they certainly suffered the brunt of the many casualties during World War II. They came out of the war with a sex ratio of about 75 males per 100 females, which is probably one of the lowest male sex ratios of any sizable population. Part of the reason for that is the patterns of life expectancy. The Bolsheviks, for whatever you want to fault them for, actually did quite a bit in the early period of greatly increasing life expectancy for both sexes. Russia's life expectancy peaked in about 1964. The rest of the developing world, life expectancy continued to go steadily upwards. Russia, it's basically been stagnant for about the last 50 years. And this is a period in the early 60s where lifestyle factors became the predominant causes of death, and the gap between men and women widened quite a bit. And you can see here, this is part of what I'm going to be focusing on, these kind of steep declines in life expectancy in the immediate post-Soviet period. Just to put this in kind of back into an Arctic perspective, this is the map that Rasmus showed yesterday, showing the male-female sex ratios across the circumpolar north. And like he said, most of the circumpolar regions have relatively more men than women, except for some of the large diversified cities. And I'm glad I didn't contradict the mayor of Akureyri yesterday. Akureyri actually has slightly more men, or more women than men. But like I said, most of the regions, the sex ratio is actually, male sex ratio is actually increasing. So I'm going to look at the last 3 Russian censuses, and this is just before this transition period started in 1989. You can clearly see that Russia has a predominantly male periphery, a predominantly female core. And then if we go forward to the first Russian census, 2002, you start to see a decline in the male population in the periphery, the Arctic northern regions, and then going forward to 2010, you overall have a population decline of about 18%, but a much larger male population decline. Let me just go back. So this is 89, 2002, and 2010. So this is what I'm going to be focusing on. And then you can take this population balancing equation I break it down by gender, which is what I've done. And for those of you who know me, I've done a lot of work on migration in the Arctic, migration to Russia. And so when I started to look at these changing sex ratios, I thought, oh, I'm going to be telling a migration story. The downsizing of the northern economy affected men more than women. So men responded logically by leaving the north in rather large numbers. So I disaggregate these components of population change. And this chart shows the net migration by region in the Russian north over this 20-year period. And you can see the blue shows the percent change for men, and then the red for women. And you can see here they're roughly equal. I mean, men and women are migrating out of the Russian north in roughly the same numbers. For the north as a whole, I mean, this is men and women, or no, this is men and women. Relatively equal, men living in slightly larger percentages than women. So this isn't a migration story that I'm going to be telling about this region. And then here I show the changes in natural increase or decrease. This is a difference between births and deaths. And now you can see what's going on or what's gone on in this region over this period. Rather large differences between men and women. And overall for the north there's been a natural increase, so there's been more female births than deaths, whereas for men there's actually been more deaths than births. So this is what actually accounts for a lot of the differences in the gender composition in the north over this 20-year period. And then to kind of delve into the reasons why, I pick out just some of the headlines. This is either from the Western press or the translated Russian press. You can read for yourself some of these different headlines. Things like the emptying of Russia. I know this guy rather well, and he talks about Russia is on the brink of a steep population decline, a peacetime population hemorrhage. And so this is the kind of language that was used to describe, and I think in some cases almost with some glee, the Russian demographic crisis, so to speak. There was a large literature kind of examining the causes of the mortality increase, the life expectancy decrease in Russia and all of the other post-Soviet states and the countries of Eastern Europe. And the conclusion was it wasn't a collapse of the healthcare system or anything. A lot of it was due to acute psychosocial stress, inability to adapt to the new situations, this transition that I talked about. And kind of the lack of coping skills. And this was, I'll argue, it's much worse in the Arctic than some of the other regions. A lot of this literature looked across all 27, 28 post-Soviet states, and the conclusion was, those countries had a social safety net put in place, especially active labor market programs. They had a decline in life expectancy, but it was very short, very shallow. And then there was kind of a continued increase, whereas in Russia and a few other states, like I showed, it continued to decline. If you look at causes of death, cardiovascular diseases, all your external causes, suicides, accidents, murders, ulcers, cirrhosis of the liver from alcohol poisoning, these were the causes of death that increased the most. And again, like I said, it's much higher in the Arctic than elsewhere. There's been a number of programs over the last, for whatever you think of Vladimir Putin, he was the first Russian president to actually notice this and to start putting in place certain measures to combat smoking, drinking, road safety, different changes in the healthcare system. But to, again, put this back into an Arctic perspective, this is from the chapter I wrote for the forthcoming Arctic Human Development Report looking at life expectancy among Arctic regions. And like I showed, there's a vast difference in life expectancy among Arctic regions here. Iceland, where we are now, the Faroe Islands have among the highest life expectancies. If you look at the Russian regions, they have among the lowest life expectancies. And this is from the United Nations. So some of these have actually life expectancy below what are called less developed countries in the world, so quite low life expectancies, and these were even lower earlier on. Part of the explanation for that is the female advantage in life expectancy in some of these regions. This is recently, these gaps were much wider. So these differences, like I said, in the Russian Arctic may be among the largest female advantages in life expectancy of any country in the world. So it's this that kind of drives the overall. I mean, there's a high correlation between overall low life expectancy and this female advantage. So my last slide, in conclusion, this isn't a migration story. It wasn't men who coped with the changing situation by, doing something positive like migrating out. It was all sorts of negative behaviors that they engaged in, which resulted in excess mortality. All the shifting gender roles, the loss of jobs, the lack of coping skills. I mean, this has affected men much more so than women across the Russian North. And this seems to be kind of a story we're telling maybe across the entire Arctic. In my 12 minutes, I know it's my timekeeper left. This is kind of a broad, quick picture, but certainly we could do a further analysis by age and look, if we focus just on the working ages, certainly by ethnicity, there's an interesting story to tell, levels of education. Those who are less educated tend to have less coping skills, and certainly we could break it down further by urban and rural, but we won't. So I'll stop there, and thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Thanks a lot, Tim, for an exciting presentation and to reveal, let's say, some other perspectives on the gender development in the Arctic. That there are similar trends, but at the same time there are also marked differences. Now, our third presenter here, Tine is also an illustration of a combined expertise, has been a researcher, especially in connection with food security and the consumption of local food, and in that connection being important contributor to the Greenlandic situation on consumption of local food as an important issue. But in addition to that, she is a rector from the University of Greenland, and therefore also heavily involved in some of the questions that has been raised here. The question of leaving, staying, ensure adequate education opportunities, etc., for Greenland. So we are looking very much forward to have your presentation on gender equality in Greenland, structural, cultural, and educational challenges. So please come forward.
First, thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I have really enjoyed the 2 days and I've learned a lot. I'm not doing research myself today, so my presentation will be mostly on what others have written, and also I will give you my own opinion in the end, and I will try and see if I could keep this in 12 minutes. It's about structural, cultural, and educational challenges, and I will admit that I will have a focus on the cultural ones. And I will start with this picture and also the next to tell you that Greenland is everything. It's a picture like this with a very few people living in a very small place, and this is such a nice place, Nordregio, up in North Greenland. The houses are just placed in this very small, narrow piece of land, and behind that they have a huge lake. And the rest is sea. But we also see this picture. This is a former block P that is torn down today. So Greenland is both the rural and also the Nuuk, especially for Nuuk's sake, really kind of more internationalized, you could say. I will present some of the funny small Rasmussen, you might know him. He interviewed a lot of Greenlandic people at that time, and he gathered a lot of, could you say them, small, they were taboos or they were sayings, they were something that maybe can describe, and I have picked some of them that I thought could be interesting for you to see. So here is one. Men fond of women, or women fond of men, know how to sharpen their tools well. They are also very ticklish. And just short about the population in Greenland, we are now stagnating around 56,000 people, and it's actually declining, and it's like for other regions in Arctic, we see the same situation without migration. If you see how it's divided, the population is divided into towns and settlements, you can see again men are more dominant in the settlements than in the towns. And again, the income situation between men and women. Men have higher income than women, not very different from other countries. Here's another citation. Women with sons must be sure that their water containers are never empty. Then their sons will be good hunters. It really describes that this is, and I will come back to that the sons placing in the middle and in the center of the world was really important in the traditional Greenlandic life. If we go to the education, this has been a learning process for me also, because I had to go down to the statistics and so, and what you see is that you have a lot of female going to the high school. 61 of the new students in gymnasium or high school, they are female, and you could say almost the same going to the vocational training schools to the high schools. So it's very typical, I think, for other countries again. And also more women get educated than men. It's in 2013, it was 62% of the educated population that were women. Women with short noses get angry easily. And here is a picture of our university. We have around 600 students, and the student population, it was almost 75% of the women. But that can also, our university is primarily focusing on humanities and social sciences. We have teacher training, nursing, social work. So you could say the studies we have are quite feminine in that sense. Another one here. When a boy is born and his first clothes are sewed, then there should be no knot in the end of the thread. On the contrary, this is fine if it's a girl. And when I wrote this, I thought, okay, this is how we raise our boys. We protect them. They must not feel any knots in their clothes. And is that why? It's telling me a lot, and it just confirms me that when we're talking about spoiled boys in Greenland, you could almost see it in a sentence like this. When we look at the unemployment situation, this was the situation in 2012. You can see for women in settlements, 17% of them are unemployed. It's a huge number, and you would say they are the same for men and women in towns. And living a more traditional life in the settlements and maybe a more patriarchal society, the women there compared to the women in the cities are taking care of the children, staying there, don't have any opportunities, don't involve maybe in politics and so. And here the sun and the moon are siblings. The sun is a woman and the moon is a man. I will come back to that later on. There is a Greenland myth on the incest ban between the sun and the moon. If you look at the women and men elected throughout the years to the parliament, you can see that there's happening something. More women are getting elected. In 2013, 35% of the women. You had a representation of women of 35% in the parliament, And we're actually having an election now, the 28th of September. It's exciting to see how if this is going to kind of develop more. This is a picture. You will notice that it's a lot of men, and there are 3 women. It's a picture from the meeting of the local councils in Sommersår municipality. That is Nuuk and some of the municipalities in the east coast, and also one south of Greenland. And these are for the village councils. And you can see they are all men, and the 3 women in the picture, the woman up there behind, she is the chair for the Municipalities Association in Greenland. She has I think she is teacher educated. The woman in the middle is the mayor of Nuuk. She is also educated. And then the woman in the front, she is a judge. So maybe don't know these men, but I would suppose a lot of them would be maybe fishers and hunters and kind of living the more traditional life in the settlements. We had a new act on equality between gender in 2013, and I will just mention the most important ones. It's like so that there must be just one more of the other gender in public boards and commissions. So you could say it's, I think, was the Icelandic, there was a 40% or quote kind. And when we suggest members for public boards, we have to suggest both a woman and a man, equal number. Here is another quote. If a woman wishes a daughter, she has to eat kabelin so dry that they curve. Kabelin, they are those small fish, and we drive them, and very nourishing for Greenlanders. Then to the cultural parts, the man's traditional roles in the traditional societies. The hunter, he was the provider, and he went for hunting, he built the kayaks, he built the hunting tools, he provided food for the family and the settlement, he educated his son. He was quite focused, quite narrow, could you say, educated his son towards hunting. And the masculine skills and abilities that you expected from him was courage, physical strength, precision, fastness, watchfulness, fearless, mobility for hunting purposes, and outdoor work. And you could say that through industrialization, he kept those roles, and he would still be the provider, just that the fishing boat replaced the kayak. And the women's traditional roles, she would be the distributor of the game in the family. She would be, of course, mother, bringing up children, the cook, the sewer, the child carer, the rower, carrier of the game, berry picker, cleaner, the upbringer. She had a lot of roles, and she was a hard worker, supporting the man and the family. Had a coordinator role, you could say, good to adapt, and you could say that she had more strings to play with. Now, if you're seeing it in a more modern way, had a lot of strings to play with. Through industrialization, she went from being a hunter's wife, she actually dropped down in her status to be a factory worker or a cleaning woman. She went out to the society, yes, but she kept her duties at home, and she also kept her low status. We had a situation where the woman followed the man. So in the traditional egalitarian society, each had their roles, men and women, and they took leadership in the situation. Like the Angakop, the shaman, he would take the leadership in religious matters. The elders, they would be the advisors and taking care of economic matters in the households. Men, they would shift in being leaders in the hunting situations. Women would be leading in the household, but also would, together with other women, take the leading positions when they shoot the huge boats, the umiaks. And among children, the boys were more valued than girls. This is my only kind of idea of how I think that although we talk about an egalitarian Inuit society, the man placed himself in the center. And he put the powerful women in a convenient distance from him. If you say that this is, how do I point? Do I use the green one to point with? Here, this is the real life. You have the hunter and his wife. He will be in the leading position there, or he would be over her. And then on long distance, it was accepted to have women role models, like up in the sky, you would have Malina, which is the moon and a man. No, Malina is the sun, is a woman, and Ningar is the moon, being a man. And there is this incest story about those actually telling a myth also to telling that incest is forbidden. And Malina, she's warmer and she's stronger than Ningar. So up in the heaven, you have a very strong sun and a woman, and down there in the sea, where you have the mother of the sea being the female guardian of morals and distribution of the hunting game and so. So in real life, he was the defining, or the man who decided things, and on long distance, he could have the female kind of role models, I think. Only in the non-human world, girls and women got positive attention at the expense of boys. Here is another example of how the boys were worshipped. It was a song. That it is a son now, it gives me joy. When he grows up, he will sail the kayak. Was it only a girl? She would never sail a kayak. Was it only a girl? There were little reason to be happy. They were very dependent on their boys being the providers of everything. And it was also like this, that the men would stay with the family. The girls, they would go to other families. So the investment in girls were less than in the boys. About men's social position today, in my opinion, is that, and I think a lot of you have already told about this, that the man has lost his traditional status. He's not in the center alone anymore. But do Greenlandic boys still get brought up like they were still alone in the center? That is my question, and I know that several agree with this question. Do we also see in Greenland a masculine business in crisis? The economic situation for Greenland is quite hard at these times. Do we also see a crisis in masculinity and also a crisis in the masculine identity? And at least we have a new situation, you could say, with the mobility, men following women going to education that is opposite from before, that now man follows the woman. About women's social position, they dominate in the societal institutions, they educate and they move towards development. They have kept their hard work ability and adaptation skills. They have kept to their known duties and the also low status jobs still. And she hasn't got used to be considered equally to the man or to go in front of him. And I know there again that Nuuk as a capital must be different from other places in Greenland. You see the symptoms of the conflict: jealousy and violence in partner relations. And 62% of all women in Greenland, they have has been exposed to violence or serious threats about violence. And in those cases, it's most the husband or the partner being responsible for that. Other symptoms: the police have yearly get 9,000 anmeldelser, how can I say, reports on domestic violence in homes. This is what is reported. Then think about what is not reported about domestic violence. And the situation seems to keep on. And the offers for that are the children and for the coming generations. So what perception should be changed? This is so short time to give you, but this is what I was thinking 2 weeks ago, that leadership in the egalitarian system, you have to drop that at least for the responsible taking of the country's situation, and it's different with leadership today. It's more formalized, and it needs other skills from the leaders. More work sharing, equal responsibilities between the genders. And then man has to accept that women want to be part of the power team. He has to relearn to take responsibility for development, for education, and for daring and courage like he actually had in traditional life. And women have to learn not to hide, to be more brave and be out in the light, take responsibility for economic development, and not only for the societal institutions. This is a picture from one of the demissions we had a few years ago. This is another one. And thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tine, for adding the picture of the situation and showing that, well, it's complex. There are issues at stake, and at the same time, well, the managers are going to be responsible for managing these situations. I'll ask the panel to come up here together with the presenters. And we will follow the same procedure as we have had in the previous sessions, being aware of that, we have, fortunately, half an hour for our discussions. It doesn't go for all persons, but I should mention that the new additions to the panel here are Eyjólfur Guðmundsson, who is a rector of the University of Akureyri, and it's Katrín Jakobsdóttir, who is from the left-wing movement in Iceland. It means that we have, well, let's say, an addition to the whole question of human resources and also the policies that are, well, going to be taken into considerations when we are talking about the equal development for equality among the gender. There is this situation that Eyjólfur has to reach a plane and therefore have to leave 10 to 3. But I'm convinced that we'll nevertheless have the opportunity to have a diverse set of comments to any questions from the audience. So I would ask you to, well, comment and come especially with questions related to what you have heard here. So who will be the first one to step forward with questions? Oh, sorry, yes. Our newcomers has to give just a few words on their position and their opinion in connection with the theme of this part of the workshop.
Thank you so much. We have to press to actually get the sound. That we have to do. Thank you. Apologies for having to run to the airport later on. But in the light of the air traffic being slow today, I cannot take the chance of catching a flight later on, since I'm joining the Arctic Circle, as many of you will, later on today. Thank the organizers for an excellent conference, and you for being here and facing the wrath of volcanoes and bad weather and still surviving. It's quite a feat. Try to be as short as possible. I found it very, very interesting when listening to Erika. I'm not going to try to put it all together because I just want to jump into what is interesting here from my perspective. Was this notion of creating conditions to be mobile. It's an excellent point because the young generation today is thinking completely different about their lives. Before becoming rector of the University of Akureyri, I was I basically lived in outer space. I was an economist for a virtual game, had inhabitants, about 500,000 people, and people all over the world participated in this single version of another universe. And we needed a lot of expertise to be able to operate this. And I was able to hire males into the company, very highly skilled, that would never have thought about moving to Iceland except for the fact they were married to Icelandic women. And they wanted to come back to the social structure once they had children. So I was able to hire quite a high caliber technical people just because the families were moving around. And then I knew that at some point the families wanted to move out again. When you talk to the people that are participating in these virtual worlds, they no longer associate themselves necessarily with a nation. They associate themselves with a virtual world. And I think that's the extreme case, but I think this is definitely happening. So with regard to the Faroese looking at themselves as Faroese, Danes that want to be in the US, it's a completely natural phenomenon. So your question about how can we increase this mobile structure is an excellent question and something that societies do not deal very well with today. And the other comment that I would like to make is it's fascinating how different the Arctic regions are and the problems that the Russians, the people living in Greenland, the Icelanders, how different these problems are. And just the chart showing this expectation of life expectancy. We must be able to learn something from data like this because it must be telling us that there are social structures that help people live a healthier life. And I will maybe leave a little bit of that question out for the rest of you and give Katrín the chance to say something.
Thank you, Eyjólfur, and thank you very much. It has been a great experience listening to you and all the other panels also. I have 3 points that I would like to make, and maybe from the perspective that I was a Minister of Education for 4 years, from 2009 to 2013. So I think education has a very vital role to play in developing every society. The first point I would like to make concerns this culture of migration, which I thought was a very good point from Erika. I think the Arctic maybe has had this culture of migration from the beginning of times, if you could say so, but new technologies are now making this culture of migration much more, you can sense it much more now because of all those new technologies. And I would like to say about this, that more mobility, more migration has actually been the political agenda in the political Western world now for the last decades. We are always talking about we need to become more mobile and we need to make the world more mobile for our young people. And then when the young people come mobile, we say we have a problem, everybody's migrating. So this is a little bit of an ambiguity here. And I think we need to ask the questions, really, are we ready to become more mobile? And if we want the people to become mobile and move back home, we need to think about the infrastructure at home. I think that's point number 2 that you have all mentioned, and not least for women, that they choose to live where there are educational opportunities, where there's a functioning welfare system, and where there's cultural diversity. I can say this for myself, I would never have become an MP or a minister if there hadn't been the Icelandic kindergarten system, if there hadn't been the Icelandic system of maternity and paternity leave, if there wasn't care for the elderly. I would never have done any of this. So obviously, I think women tend to seek out societies where these things are functioning. And that's why I think this is a very important thing. And I think culture is an underestimated aspect there, because culture is such a big part here in really filling our lives. So this is point number 2. And the last point I would like to make is really, I think educational system has actually a role to do when we talk about, and what you were talking about, in Greenland and in Russia, the crisis of man, the crisis of masculinity. I think this is a very important thing, because we have an educational system built on subjects, so we learn a little Icelandic and a little maths and English and history. But do we learn the skills to use all the things we learn to understand ourselves a little bit better? And this is not a new thing to say, because this is what Aristotle said. You know, the greatest knowledge is to know thyself. And it's very difficult. You see that women have actually adapted more rapidly to this society. It has changed so dramatically for the last 100 years, for just the last few decades. It has changed so dramatically. The women have adopted more rapidly, and the men are finding it more difficult, maybe because they haven't the skills really to know themselves. Their self-identity, and I know I'm a politician, so I really don't know anything about what I'm saying. I just thought this while they were talking. So now they can actually comment and say, well, it's not really true what you're saying there. But I think it's a question to be raised. Is this something that we pay enough attention to in our educational system, thinking about what makes us us? And I think definitely gender is one of the important things that makes me, and Eyjólfur. It's gender. But we never talk about it in our educational system. Actually, we have a new curriculum now in Iceland where gender equality is supposed to be one of the pillars. And I think that we should not be telling the children, men and women should be equal. Well, maybe we should be saying them, but we should tell them, think about what it is that makes you a man or a woman, and whether you find it important or you feel like a man or a woman. I think this is a very important thing for children to think about, and now I know it's being done in several schools, and I hope every kid gets this experience, really, not only in Iceland and not only around the Arctic, but around the world. So, 3 points. Thank you.
And we have the first question down there. Yeah, you will be the first.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for rushing here. I also have to catch the same plane and the same taxi, actually. But I just wanted to add a comment here, and I don't know what I should call myself, being maybe not frank, but I don't remember the right English word, but kind of welcome after. The indigenous peoples, indigenous cultures depend on migration. We can't depend on the same resource all the time, so the basis for our culture is migration. So that is just at that point. But I was inspired by Erika's presentation and wanted to quote a Sami poet that actually is the only one that has received the Nordic Literature Prize, Nils Aslak Valkeapää, or Eyjólfur. One of his books is called My home is where my heart is. My home is where my heart is, and I carry it with me. So that is opposite to what the Western world would say, that home is where your heart is. So it is, it's a bit different attitude to the migration. So this is something we have long experience on. Thank you. And thank you for having me here. I'm leaving now, so goodbye.
Anna will be the next one.
Thank you for a very interesting session, all of you. I have a question and a comment on you, Erika, and the encouragement to enable mobile lifestyles. Also in relation to Eyjólfur's comment that young people nowadays, they don't necessarily, their sort of framework of reference is not necessarily the national entity anymore. And I can identify some of those issues raised in interviews I've been conducting with young people in the north of Iceland, that their attitude towards settlement in the future, it is not necessarily based on one place, but the wish for multi-locational lifestyles. And but they see a lot of restraints on doing that because of structural restraints, I guess, also values and social control. And I know that in Finland, this is also the case for that young people are referring to multi-locational lifestyles as some kind of future aspiration. But then I know for Faroes that you have a problem, and that there are not only possibilities included in those, I guess, dramatic social changes and demographic changes as well. There are also problems, and I know that many of the Faroe families with the provider living aboard an oil platform in the sea, that this sort of slight, socio-economic slight, if you can call it, has resulted in that many of those migrant families express a less wish to pay to the sort of the social security system because they're only partially part of it, part of the year. And so I know this, Marita Rasmussen has problematized this heavily. I don't know what you call it in Faroese, yeah. But it's for the social security system is being devalued in this process. And I also think that there are challenges related to labor rights, because if you look at employment-related mobility patterns in Canada, this is very much the case. So if you can maybe elaborate a little bit about the challenges that this entails also.
Thank you. I think if I understand you correctly, are you referring to the fact that when many of the, in this case, long-distance workers, which are men, when they are working abroad, they are very often part of the NIS and DIS systems where you actually pay tax abroad and not in the Faroe Islands. Now that's obviously an issue because the more people that are long-distance worker under these systems, the more people are not paying taxes directly in the Faroes. Yet they are using the welfare system, and indeed so are their families. And often these men earn a lot of money on Norwegian oil rigs, and they earn so much that it actually is a disincentive for the female back home to be working. So there are two issues here, I think. One is, how can we enable mobile lifestyles while people at the same time are contributing to the upkeep of society and indeed the welfare system in terms of money-wise? That may mean moving away from purely income tax to other forms of taxes, reducing income tax and so on. And I'm trying to remember what your other point was. The labour rights. I'm not sure I know exactly what you're referring to, but I believe that the labour rights in the Faroe Islands are relatively intact, I think. I mean, these people are working under systems where they may, in some cases, have better rights in Scandinavian systems, but definitely in terms of women contributing, and we have an issue because we have an ageing population because we have too few females, and I know that all over the Western world we have ageing populations, but we have it in a more extreme form in the Faroes. So we will see a situation where there are far too few people on the labour market. So if you've got people, especially females, working 50% of the time, that contributes to the problem. So we need to have incentives and the ability for females to work full-time. And yes, and that was the other point, the welfare system. It simply does not enable women to pursue, well, in many cases, to have a flexible enough labour market and welfare system for them to pursue careers and full-time jobs, if they so wish, whilst their partners or husbands are away for at least 50% of the time. I don't know if that answered your question.
Next comment.
Yes, excuse me. On the question of willingness to pay for social services, it's a very good question. Because as soon as you stop identifying yourself to a certain area or a certain nation, that question comes up, why should I pay? And I think this has been seen in Europe for a long time, where we have seen migrant workers from the Middle East coming to Europe and then sending the money back home. So there's a lot of things that can be learned from that. But the basic thing that we all should be thinking about, and I don't have the answer for you, but I only have the question. The world, the next generation that's coming up is living in a completely different world. Completely connected, location doesn't matter, nationality not as important as before. What kind of social structures, social infrastructure do you need to be able to support that? And those that do not adapt, they will change, and maybe that's what's happening in Russia.
Might I add to that? I think this is a very exciting debate, because if we think about nation states, they're a relatively new invention, if you could say that, from the 19th century. So it's highly probable that they will change. And I think the challenge is, as Eyjólfur says, how can we continue having some sort of a social welfare state without having a nation state? Is that possible? And we're always heading for this more mobility, but we haven't really answered these questions, because we all want to have a secure social welfare state, but we still want to be very mobile. So this is maybe the greatest challenge of them all.
And now I have to apologize myself. I have to run for that airplane, but thank you all so much.
My name is Heleniak. I would like to comment on this mobility issue that I think is very interesting. And what came to my mind is recent research done in the east part of Iceland about people that have moved away, really want to contribute to the society where they grew up. And they want to find ways to do that. That's something we have to think about too in that way. But what I wanted to ask about, to get some comments on, is from what Tine was telling us about, Tine, that what kind of university programs do you think we should work out to get more young men to attend university? And in what fields?
We have a part of the engineering education. You can take that in Greenland, the first 1.5 years of the bachelor, and then you have to finish it in Denmark. So we have the start of the engineering. At university level, we are now discussing how to have more natural resource into the university. We have an Institute for Natural Resources in Greenland focusing on stocks, on living resources, giving advice to the government. And they're just now starting to go into the education field also. So this is a slow growing process, but I think it's kind of that stuff, the fishing biologist or something, and then there has been our university was founded on a study at Copenhagen University at that time, focusing on they call it Eskimology at the time, so quite humanistic. So university was founded on those and has really stick to that field, and now we have to rethink and also think the necessity of building up also university programs in the country, and not everything has to be taken in Denmark and Copenhagen. So this has also been a kind of political disagreement. Should you invest in more university studies in Greenland, because we have this critical mass issue also, and. But I think this is the only way forward. Maybe starting up some of the programs, then you can continue in other places. So building bridges between universities is very important for us as a small university. because internationalization is also important. Yeah.
While I'm waiting for... Yeah, go ahead.
Here, because I'm thinking about this. Why do men not go to university? Is it because it's nothing they want to learn there, or is it because their identity, the educated male, is not somehow part of their masculine identity? I would just like to throw this to you. What do you think?
I think?
Yeah. I will ask this educated male here. Is it part of his identity being an educated male?
I guess I'm an overeducated male in some respects. I don't know. We're specifically focused here on the Arctic, but I think I forget exactly when, but in the United States, I think some 20 years ago, female enrollment in colleges. We're not talking about the Arctic, we're just talking in general. There's more women enrolled in colleges than men, and that gap has kind of widened over time. So I don't know what the explanation is, and we keep focusing on the Arctic and young men who, and Rasmus has done work on this, and Larry Hamilton and others. I guess it goes back to this attitude. Men have certain male jobs that they go after, and women have certain female jobs, and it's just really hard to. To break away from that, and I don't know any solution. But
I have another presentation at the Arctic Circle, and that's going to also focus on the identity. And what I can experience from my daily life is that Greenlandic men, their identity is so much in the hunting and the fishing. Mm-hmm. So it's hard for them to actually step aside and think that the world consists of other things. It's so much deeply in there, especially if you're grown up with it. You're not seen as a proper Greenlandic man if you don't go hunting. So the hunting identity is not something that you can just, in 1 or 2 generations, change. So I think role models are, again, important to have, and for women see more and more educated role models. And we have a saying in Greenland that young Greenlandic women are taking over middle-aged Danish men's jobs. And this is what we see more and more. And the next step must be that we get more role models. I think it will come, but it just goes slow.
And maybe hard work on the sea make them less ticklish. And waiting for the next person. Well, I just have to jump in for a minute because I'm not a representative for the Nordic Council of Ministers. I'm just working for them. But in connection with the question of mobility, you should be aware of that working within the Nordic Council of Ministers, you will be allowed to leave your position and return to the position within a time frame of 8 years, and there is also support for you going, for instance, to Nordregio in Stockholm, and then returning to where you came from. So I think there are some ideas out there that promote the idea of mobility and ensuring that the Nordic countries have mobility within themselves. And then we had, I've forgotten who was raising a hand, but you remember? Yeah, good.
Yes, hello, my name is Martha Einarsdóttir. I'm from the University of Akureyri Research Center. And I've been hearing again and again the different lectures about masculinities, femininities changing, and then of domestic violence and the increase, or maybe not the increase, but the prevalence of domestic violence. And this speaks very much to research I did in Mozambique, where I was talking to women who went back to education as adults. And it came out that a lot of them were suffering domestic violence that they linked to this education. Not maybe the cause, but it seemed that men saw it as a threat. Those men especially who were unemployed and who themselves were not educated. So I'm wondering whether this is the case as well, for example in Greenland, that since the ideology changes much, the economic situation changes faster than the ideology, whether it's a backlash of the men to take their frustrations out at home on their wives, possibly, or children, when they don't get work or where they feel that they are threatened. So that's maybe a question to Tine. And then, if this is the problem in the Nordic, maybe the rape culture in Iceland could be one aspect of this, that men who are frustrated then take it on in this way. But how do we then talk together or change the discourse so that men and women are not competing for power, and how are you, what's the new man, what's the new woman, how can we all live together peacefully? That's kind of what I was wondering about. Thank you.
The answer for any question of development in Greenland is education. There are so much things to gain by education. And my theory, and I just asked Peter Bjergård on mail if he could find some data showing about if educated women are less experienced, what do you call it, that they don't experience violence as much as non-educated, because something happens when you educate, and I think that's for the good concerning violence between partners. But it might also be, I don't know, the other thing, I don't know, but I would expect the other thing, the other way, that when you're educated, having your self-esteem and self-belief, I think that the setting of borders, which is also really an issue in Greenland, that is, I think, has something with the culture also, that respect for the individual's borders and setting limits in daily life, in school, at home, in child upbringing. It's really an issue. So this is what we hear daily, and also demanding more of each other. I think there is so much still to gain by education, because by that something happens with education. So that's the only question, the answer I have to that.
And we are very close to ending this session. There are 2 minutes for the last question, if it is available, or comment. Also comments from, yeah.
Because I think you talked about how can we change this? How can men and women just cooperate peacefully? We haven't found the solution, but it's very important, because right now we're talking about the Arctic, and the history of the Arctic is really being rewritten and reinvented right now. And those who are writing the biggest part of it are actually the big corporations looking out for resource exploitation in the Arctic. And those corporations are mostly male-dominated. So it's definitely not women who are writing the history of the Arctic now, even though we're sitting here and talking about other issues. I think the biggest political issues are very heavily male-dominated in the discourse, and that's something for us women interested in the Arctic to think about. How can we participate in writing the narrative of the Arctic? Because I think that's a very important process happening right now in front of us, and will have great effects really on the future of the Arctic.
Well, thank you very much for that final comment. Thank you for the participation of the audience, and thank you for the panelists for excellent contributions.